Okay, first of all, I'm going to ask for somebody to help me keep on time so I don't go off on so many rabbit trails that we have to,
I'm good at that.
because my back is to the clock, okay? Okay, let's see, why don't you let me know when it's 11:15, okay? First of all, I want to thank you all, and the reason that I asked Pastor to come and talk today is November 11th was Veterans Day, but it was also the 400th anniversary of the signing of the Mayflower Compact, which was signed, obviously, in 1620. And I had an ancestor whose family was on the Mayflower. And I've given you a copy of the Mayflower Compact. And I'm just going to do a few introductory comments, and then we'll talk about this. And then I'd like to tell you a little bit about my ancestors' family. Now, it is interesting that Veterans Day, I had a veteran, an ancestor who was a veteran in the Revolutionary War. I also belong to the Daughters of the American Revolution. And since my family came over in 1620, there might have been somebody in the War of 1812. I'm not sure about the Civil War, and my grandfather was not in World War I. He was too old. And my father was not a veteran of World War II because he was in his 40s and he also worked in the steel industry. So he worked in the foundry of a steel mill. So he got a deferment. My brother did serve in the Vietnam conflict. No one that I know of served in a direct ancestors served in the Korean War. I had relatives in the Korean War, and as I said, my brother served in Vietnam, not in Vietnam. He was in Ingolstadt, Germany, because in high school he had taken one semester of typing. And so instead of going to the jungle, he went into the communications section in Ingolstadt, and he and his wife roamed around Europe on weekends and had a marvelous time. So, someone asked on which side of my family goes back to the Mayflower. Okay. My original, do you want to come help me, Samantha? Okay. Can you stand over here, please? Okay. My ancestor that came on the Mayflower, John and Eleanor Billington. Okay? And if you look down, you will find that John Billington signed the Mayflower Compact. I'm not sure that's in correct order, but he was a 26th signer. He had two sons, John Sr., Jr., and Francis. Francis Billington married and had a daughter, Mary Billington Sabin. Sarah Sabin married a Kingsley. You want to hold that up a little higher? There. Okay. She had a son named Amos Kingsley, who had a son named Elijah Kingsley. Elijah Kingsley fought in the Revolutionary War, He was born in 1744 and died in 1801. My sister and I have visited his grave in Massachusetts and marked it. He had a daughter named Ruth Kingsley who married David Hitchcock. Now, the Hitchcock family came to America in 1630. They were probably part of the Puritans that settled in Massachusetts, in Boston. Ruth Kingsley had a son named Abner Hitchcock. My sister and I visited Abner's grave in Battle Creek, Michigan. George Augustus Hitchcock was a son. We don't know where, we know that George Augustus Hitchcock is buried in a pauper's grave in St. Louis. He was an alcoholic artist, okay? His son was Emil Gaelic Hitchcock. That was my grandfather. He lived with my mother's father. He lived with us the first 15 years of my life. He died in 1959, and he is buried in St. Louis. This is my mother, Elise Hitchcock Dorr. She died in 1997 and is buried in Davenport, Iowa. Here I am, Barb Dorr Gregersen, and I'm still alive. Okay, thank you very much. You may sit down. Okay, you want to go? May I have that in, please? Thank you. So, I forgot to count how much it is. I think I'm the 16th generation. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Sorry, 12. Now, my sister's also a member of the Mayflower, and she has a son, so that would be the 13th generation, and a daughter, 2 sons and a daughter, and the one son has 3 children, so they would be the 4th generation down. So, there it is. Okay, why the Mayflower Compact is important. First of all, this was signed November 11th, 1620, after the Pilgrims had made a 66-day trip from the southern tip of England, and they were in the harbor, and they were supposed to land in Virginia, and Virginia was still under the English government under King James. But the Mayflower had been pushed north because of the winter storms, and so it landed in what was land that was not claimed by England yet. And there were 102 passengers, and I'll talk a little more about that later. Only 50 of them came for religious reasons. The other 52, and the Billington family was part of that 52, came for different reasons. We don't know why my ancestors came over. They were originally from London. One of the information I found out said that he was a seller of frippery. Frippery, F-R-I-P-P-E-R-Y. I think he ran a Goodwill store. I'm not sure. Frippery was, you know, the fancy stuff. But he probably was in trouble with the law. Okay? Okay. And when the 52 people who were not here for religious reasons found out that they were not under King James's rule anymore. They said, aha, we're going to do whatever we want to do because there is no law here. And the religious leaders under William Bradford decided if we're going to be here, we've got to have some kind of government. Now, in Europe and in most of the world, the government was either hereditary or by might. You know, the army took over or... Yes? Where did they land? Okay, they first landed in Providence, which is now what would be Rhode Island. And it was interesting. You have to realize they had been on board for 66 days. Nobody's clothes had been washed. And the men went on land, and it was all sandy. If you've ever been up in Providence, and they said, we can't stay here. And the women said, excuse me, we're doing laundry. So they made the men take them ashore, and they did some washing, and the kids finally got. But that's where they landed, and they had to they sailed Cape Cod there, and they finally found an area. They were looking for fresh water, and they were looking for land that could support crops, and they needed wood because they had to build houses. So some of the men, and it was the religious men, decided we've got to have a form of government, but it can't be based on heredity because, we have no kings in our ancestry, and it can't be power arms. Miles Standish was hired he was a military man. He wasn't there for religious reason either. He was hired to teach everybody else how to defend the colony. So this is a compact. It's a document defining and limiting the functions of the government, okay? And it says, William Bradford made this reference. It said, this day before we came to harbor, observing some not well affected to unity and concord. That meant the 52 people who were not there for religious reasons, but gave some appearance of faction. It was thought good there should be an association and agreement that we should combine together in one body and to submit to such government and governors as we should by common consent agree to make and choose and set our hands to this that follows, word for word. Now, the interesting thing is it's common consent. As far as history goes, this is really the first government that was by the consent of the governed, which is the basis of our democracy. So, and you can read here, we whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of the dread sovereign Lord King James. They acknowledge that they're still under the rule of King James, although not technically.
Well, dread isn't, it's not a negative term, it's...
Well, the dread sovereign, that meant respected.
Right, yeah. We have dread as, oh, I dread doing this, but...
Well, they really...
I mean, they may have dreaded him, but I mean...
By the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith. By the way, they were separatists. They didn't think he was defending the faith. In fact, he was persecuting them. Having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Now, Jamestown had been settled in Virginia in 1607, but it had kind of disappeared. By the way, the men in Jamestown didn't bring any women with them. So men back then weren't used to cooking and washing. There is some evidence that the first African slaves came to Jamestown, and they were women, because the men said, who's going to do the washing? Who's going to do the cooking? Not I. Okay, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, and the furtherance at the end, gather, covenant, and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereto do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony. Okay, that's important. All these laws were for the good of the people, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience, in witness whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod on 11 of November, the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, Ireland. 54 Anno Domini 1620. Okay, what's really interesting, you will find sometimes it's said that this was signed on November 21st. In 1620, the civilized world was under the Julian calendar. We are under the Georgian calendar. Gregorian, sorry.
I think, yeah.
Yes. They discovered that the Julian calendar had miscalculated how long it took the Earth to go around the sun. And in 1552, the calendar was adjusted by 11 days, by 10 days. In America, America did not adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1752. In 1752, 10 days were admitted from the month of September to make the calendar correct. Okay. Why the compact is important is, first of all, it's by the consent of the governed, and secondly, the laws were to be for the general good of the population. And it was those concepts were mentioned in the Declaration of Independence and in our national constitution. So that is the importance of that. By the way, the starred names are the families, the men who had descendants. Some of the men didn't have descendants. And up until 5 years ago, you had to prove that one of the men was your ancestor. 5 years ago, they changed that. And there are people now who are members of the Mayflower Society that came from some of the women. Now, there were indentured servants that came along. You all know what indentured servants are? Okay, it wasn't a slave. You had a limited time. Okay, and some of those women were indentured servants, and they married men who came over on later ships. There was another ship that came in the fall of 1621 that had 39 men on it. And also there was intermarriage with some of the Puritans who settled in Massachusetts. By the way, this is how a Pilgrim woman would be dressed. Notice, I am not dressed in black and white. That's the Puritans. So the painting that we're all used to seeing of the Pilgrims, that quote, Pilgrims at the first Thanksgiving, wrong. Because the Puritans who landed in Massachusetts in 1630, they were more interested in commercial activities, they were wealthier, and they were better known, and the Pilgrims kind of faded. Pilgrims the women wore long skirts, and the colors were called sad colors, not because they were dismal, but just because they were kind of dark. Hello there.
Hello.
Men and women both wore these kind of hats. They kept the rain and the sun off. By the way, women always wore long sleeves, neck. You did not want the sun to touch your skin, and of course this saved your face. This was called a waistcoat. Always wore an apron. This is your pocket. It was on the outside, and they would probably carry a sewing kit, a napkin, whatever they needed. They had the neck pieces. This is one style. And I'm going to take this off now. They did wear a head covering at all times because your hair was long, it wasn't cut, and also you were living in houses that had thatched roofs, so ceilings. So there was stuff falling out of the ceiling, hay, straw, insects, everything. So this is what they wore. I don't have the kind of shoes they wear because I can't do that. All right. Do you have any questions about the Mayflower Compact?
I have one question.
Yes.
Several of the men are Mr. and several are not. I'm guessing that was a class distinction.
Yeah, they did allow some of the male indentured servants to sign because they were often not part of the religious group. And by the way, the difference between a pilgrim and a Puritan. Pilgrims were separatists. They wanted to separate completely from the Church of England. They felt that the Church of England had gone so far away from pure doctrine that they wanted to separate entirely. And they had been persecuted in England. They'd lost their lives, they'd lost their jobs, and they moved to Netherlands for quite a while. And the Netherlands had more tolerance of a different religious, but the children were beginning to be more like the Dutch people, and the leaders said, we've got to find a place where we can be separate and train our children to come up, and they're not going to be influenced by the Dutch. And so they decided to come. The Puritans only wanted to purify. the Church of England. They were willing to still be under the rule of the Church of England, but they wanted to purify it. And so there was the difference. How many people? I got to look at my notes. My mind is, okay. First of all, as I said, there were 102 aboard, 52 were separatists, no, 50 were separatists, and 52 were not. Originally, there were 2 ships that had been commissioned to bring those 102 passengers over, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. They were in Southampton, and they were ready to leave. Excuse me. I'm losing my notes, I'm sorry. They were set to leave on August, the end of August, 1620. So the Speedwell and the Mayflower left. The Speedwell developed leaks and was sent back for repairs. And they set out again, and the repairs didn't work. So they finally decided, okay, the Mayflower is going to go, and it left Southampton, England, September 6, 1620. Okay? 102 people on the Mayflower. Okay, the Mayflower was 90 feet long, which is about 10 feet longer than the gymnasium, the Hilmer Center. It was 26 feet wide. Okay, look at the green line here, green line there. Okay? 102 people. Now you got to realize they did not take up all 90 feet because there were 23 sailors, and there were captain's quarters, sailors' quarters. They were this was a cargo ship, and it was called between decks. The ceiling, 5 feet.
No problem.
Jan and Sandy could stand up, and the children. The rest of us couldn't, okay? So,
Barb,
yes.
did 102, did everybody survive? Was that it?
Out of the 102, everyone survived that 66-day voyage.
It's amazing.
How, I don't know. It was, well, it says here a passenger cabin. By the way, the Billingtons had enough money to have a cabin, quote. A cabin meant there was a bed. By the way, there were 4 Billingtons. They had a rope strung, and they had a cloth that they could pull for privacy. There was no cooking because you didn't build a fire on a wooden boat, okay? Obviously, there were no restrooms. They had chamber pots and threw it out a window. It was winter in the North Atlantic. Storms. They didn't get above deck very often at all. Okay.
Barb,
Yeah.
so did they collect rainwater for drinking probably?
They could collect rainwater. They had beer.
That's how they survived.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk to little kids about having beer, everybody drank beer and they go, oh, I said, they did have water, but of course it got very buggy and yucky. Beer, the alcohol, beer was the only thing safe to drink.
Yeah, water was not safe because of waterborne
Yeah,
bacteria, whatnot.
bacteria and everything like that. They did bring some animals and tools and gunpowder and fishing lines. Their food, they had biscuits, which you can imagine were like rocks by the end of it. Some cheese, root vegetables. Everybody drank beer. That was just the way it was. They did have a storm during the middle of the voyage, and the mast broke in half, the main mast, and the Pilgrims are the ones who figured out how to support it, and so the mast did survive. They sighted land on November 9, 1620, and they did the Mayflower Compact. They were in the harbor. John Carver was named the governor. He died shortly after they landed, and William Bradford became the governor. As I said, all 102 survived, and there was a child born late in the trip, and they named him Oceanus. And he was the one born on the ship. Now, excuse me for just a minute. When they landed, pulled into the harbor, they sent men ashore in the longboats, or shallops, what they call them, and they found that they had fresh water, there was good ground, and they even found buried underground some grain, which they appropriated, and they said, whoever this belongs to will pay them back later. By the way, they did. And the reason they found all this good land was there had been a group of native people called the Wampanoags that had lived there. And there was a young Wampanoag boy who had been kidnapped at the age of about 10 by some European fishermen. The Pilgrims and Jamestown were not the first Europeans that came along the East Coast. There had been fishermen that had come along the East Coast since the late 1500s. And they were in the habit of kidnapping young native boys and turning them into slaves. And also, they stayed with the natives, and the natives had no immunity to smallpox. And so the Wampanoags had been wiped out by a smallpox epidemic that the European fishermen had brought. So that's why this area was clear. And that's why later on, when Squanto showed up, speaking English, they all looked at that as providence of God. And the story was Squanto had been taken and sold to some people in Spain who had sold him to some monks in England. who had taught him English, and he kept saying he wanted to go back, so they provided the money to have Squanto go back to America. And of course, when they left him at where he thought his family was, with the Wampanoag tribe, there was nobody there. And so he went to another tribe close by. And when they found out that tribe found out there were English-speaking people now on the land, they sent Squanto and say, find out why they're here. And of course he walks in and says, hi, and no. So Squanto and Samoset didn't speak English, but they befriended the Pilgrims and kind of acted as spies. Okay, you all look tired, and I've gone, okay, why don't you stand up for a few minutes and just stretch? I'll find my notes, and then we'll go on, okay? Everybody stand up, stretch, get coffee, whatever needs to be done.
Yesterday, we sat so much here at the organ workshop that it was good to stand up. Yeah.
I thought there was a stool. Is there? No.
There is a stool. A stool that she could rest on.
Rita, could you get me a stool from out in the hallway? Oh, has he got one? No. Well, no, that's not going to work. I got Rita. Okay, as soon as Rita brings a stool, because my knees are giving out on me.
Did you already say what the asterisk indicated on
Oh,
this?
those are the men who had descendants. Okay? In other words, those are the people that, thank you, legitimately can say we had an ancestor. That's the ancestor. Okay. All right. Yes. No. All right. Now that my knees are back where they. Okay. I knew I had written down how many. Okay. Originally, there were, out of the 102, there were 49 men, 18 women, 18 women, 36 children. And that counted Oceanus. And I'm not sure, I think some of the indentured servants were considered children because they weren't. Now, they landed in the winter, okay? The Mayflower Compact was signed November 11th, but they really didn't settle on the Plymouth area until December 5th. Now, there were no houses. There were no crops. They had water. They lived on that ship until March. Okay, the winter. It was anchored in the harbor. The men would go ashore, cut down, tried to build buildings. The first building they built was on a hill, and it was called the Meeting House, and it was also the fort. It was the church. I have there, William Brewster was leading. They built the fort first because they did not know they had intermittent contact at a distance with the natives. Nobody really shot at anybody. But can you imagine? You lived all winter on that ship. By March, there were 22 men alive, 4 women, 25 children. Half of them had died before they ever really lived at Plymouth. I can't imagine being on a ship all winter. They had fresh water. They had fish.
Beer?
Maybe deer. Yeah. They probably had some protein. Yes.
Were you disappointed when you saw the Plymouth Rock? I was.
Oh yeah, and Plymouth.
Huge, and it's not even as big as this table.
Rock
Plymouth.
outside Faith Lutheran is bigger?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And the whole bit about the rock is just, it's just story. I mean, they said, you know, somebody had to put their foot down on something to get ashore. It's a big whoop. Okay. Oh, by the way, more pilgrims than strangers. Strangers were the ones who didn't come for religious reasons. More strangers survived that winter than pilgrims. So, and out of all those deaths, none of the Billingtons died. I think part of the reason was John and Eleanor, John Sr. and Eleanor were probably in their late 30s. John Jr. was 16, Francis was 14. So they, you know, probably the ones that died were the younger children. And the women, of course, who took care of the sick? The women. So, and think about it. That first Thanksgiving, okay, there were 50 pilgrims left. And Chief Massasoit, who was head of the natives, chief of the Wampanoag natives that lived in that area, who William Bradford and Massasoit had made a compact, and they had agreed to defend each other from enemies, brought 90 with them.
For dinner?
Yes, to the first Thanksgiving.
Did they tell the women first, though?
No. So you figure there were 4 women and maybe some young girls. The feast took 5 days. The natives did bring deer, probably some wild pheasants and things like that. But I'm going, 4 adult women? I can't even put a meal together for 5 people. I mean, it's just, okay. The Billington family had a lot of interesting things about them. First of all, the only thing written about John Billington Sr. by William Bradford was he was a knave and a scoundrel. John Billington He got in trouble with Miles Standish because all of the men were supposed to march military type thing and take duty guarding against the natives and everything. And John Billington often didn't show up for his duty. And there are cases where they did have a trial system. By the way, women could testify at a trial. That was different than the English back in England. And if you were found guilty of certain crimes, you weren't executed. You would just say, okay, you're banished from the colony. Goodbye. You have no gun and you have no knife. If God wants you to survive, you will. If not, you won't. And John Billington never came to trial then. Okay. I will bring my little friend out. Okay, introduce yourself. Well, I'm Frances Dillington, and I was on the Mayflower with my father, John, and mother. Well, yes, okay. Well, you are dressed, well, yes, I am dressed like a young man. I have my waistcoat and my hat and my breeches, well, yes, and my pocket. There it is. Okay. Well, you know what, John? You're not going to embarrass me, are you? Well, yes, I am. I just spilled coffee all over. You are so clumsy, Mother. You don't need to mention that. Okay. Until boys and girls were about 4 or 5, they would wear a long dress. And then when I was about 5 or 6, I got to dress like a real man. Until that time, they were dressed like that. Thank you very much, Diane. You're not really going to show that. Well, yes, I am. On their dress, they had what they call leading strings. So when a child was learning how to walk, you could hold on to that and they wouldn't fall over. No, you're not putting it on my head. Well, they also had padded rings that they would put on the child's head, so if they fell down, they wouldn't hurt their head or knocking into the bottom of the table. I'm not going to suggest that at preschools anymore. It's a very good idea. Oh.
Use a pole.
Women always had napkins that they wore over their shoulder. The women would put it on their lap when they ate. The men would tuck. No, you're not. Okay. Would tuck it up at their neck, but they were rather large. And the little, I didn't play with this. No, you didn't. The little girl had poppets, which were little dolls that I would make, mothers would make. Okay, do you want to tell about the trouble you got into? No. Well, if you won't tell, I will. Okay, on December 5th, everyone was still on the Mayflower, and John Jr. and I got bored. Yes, and what were you doing? Well, we went down where the guns and the gunpowder were kept, and we were lighting squibs. Okay, squibs were like twisted cloth that you would use. We almost blew up the Mayflower. Yes, and you got in trouble with William Bradford. Well, yes, we did. And later, when we got on land, John Jr. disappeared. That's right. John Jr. was just gone. And everybody was worried about him. Yes, but about a week later, we got word from Massasoit that John Jr. was with the natives. And so William III had to get a rescue party. Well, yes, and I mean, everybody was so concerned, they were afraid that John Jr. had been, hurt or tortured or something. Right. He came back with feathers in his hair and beads around his neck. Yes, and he was telling what a wonderful time he had had with the natives. Yes. It didn't end that well. No. As I said, I'm descended from Francis Billington. There are no descendants of John Billington because in 1627, he disappeared again. There are absolutely no records of John Billington Jr. after 1627. We don't know, none of the records know whether he went back to the natives, whether he was hurt on a hunting trip, or what happened to him. So I was left. Yes, but you were very, very successful. Yes, I did become a deacon in the church. Yes, and I married a young widower. Yes, and she had 2 children, and we had 11 more. She was a very good and faithful wife. Okay, yes, she was. Well, I am going to put you away. Okay. And, no, it is. And I am descended from one of Francis's daughters, as you notice from that. Okay. Like I said, the winter was very, very bad. But after Samoset, one last story, and then I'll take some questions, and then you've been a very, very good audience. I did say that John Billington Sr. was not highly regarded by the people. And these pictures of Plymouth were from 1627. There was another, as I said, another ship with passengers, but no supplies came in 1621, the fall of 1621. There were other ships that did come with supplies off and on, and there were some of the original Plymouth settlers settled outside of Plymouth, but they still lived under the Mayflower Compact. And once a year, those outlying towns would send representatives to Plymouth to make the laws that would govern all of that. So that is the start of representative government in America, because everybody from those outlying villages couldn't come, so they would send a representative who would speak for the outlying villages and then take the laws and rules back to the village. Originally, when the Plymouth colony was set up, or they called it the plantation, all the land was owned in common. And you were expected to go work the community land and everybody would be fed. Well, by 1627, or before then, they discovered there were some people that weren't working, but they expected to be fed. Yes. So they said, okay, we're going to give you, each family, a plot of land. You work the land, you eat off of what you produce and what you make, okay? And there was still quite a division between the Pilgrims, or the Separatists, the religious group, and the non-religious group, okay? And it was getting so that sometimes some of the rules and laws seemed to favor the non-religious group because there were more of them. So, in 1630, John Billington Sr. had the honor of being the first pilgrim executed for capital murder in the colony. He was hung. There seems to be a little bit of discrepancy about the justice of his trial. He had land, the Billington family had land, and there was a separatist that was John Billington caught poaching off of his land. And so he shot the man in the arm, brought him back to the, quote, surgeon, who also happened to be the barber. And the man died of gangrene. Well, when he came to trial, it's kind of like, this is a legal way to get rid of this irritant. So he was convicted of capital murder, although he had only shot the guy in the arm. He had brought him back to the medical services, and the man, who happened to be a pilgrim or part of the church group, died. It's interesting, talk about women's rights. Some of the laws that were passed was a widow could inherit 1/3 of her husband's property. So when John Billington was executed, Eleanor was left some of the property. That's totally different than how it was in England. Also, women could testify at a trial. We don't know if Eleanor did or not. And this is interesting. A man could not buy or sell his house or property without the consent of his wife. Now that is huge back then. Now I don't know how long that lasted. By the way, as Francis had said, he did join the church. He became a deacon of the church. He did marry and have quite a few children. Eleanor Billington did remarry after John was executed, but she was not of an age to have any children. And there is one incident where she was put in stocks for blasphemous speech. So she had a mouth that she didn't know when to keep quiet, and that might be an inherited trait. Because of Squanto and Massasoit and the Pilgrims had peaceful doings until Massasoit died and his son became head of the tribe. Bradford had died. The Puritans who had come in 1630 had problems with the natives. It was an uproar. Massasoit's son called himself King Philip. And there, if you go back in history, there is a war called the King Philip War, where massacres on all sides. And when you go to visit Plymouth, you have to go through the Wampanoag village, the Wampanoag site, to get there. And there are reenactors that are not related to any of the pilgrims that are there. My sister and I visited there 2 times. Neither one of those times were any of the Billingtons at home. We talked to their neighbors. Their neighbors didn't like them. Anyway, but in the Wampanoag village, all of the reenactors are direct descendants from the tribe that was there in 1620. They are relearning their language, and there's signs all over that say you don't say how, you don't call them Indians. They are American natives. And my sister and I visited in the village, and we went into what they call their longhouse. And it's interesting. We had to get on our hands and knees to crawl into there because their doorway was only about 3 feet tall. And we said, we got in there and we stood up, and of course, the roof was quite high, and it's around like that. And we asked the native that was there, they said, why was the doorway so, it was very uncomfortable getting in here. And he said, right, very easy to defend, because if an enemy went in, they had to get in on their hands and knees, and you just stood at the door and you knocked them over the head, and they stacked up. And so all of the doorways of the longhouses were very, and they said, we're used to it. And my sister and I going, we're going to have to crawl out of here. Maybe we'll just stay here. Okay. And there is a wonderful museum. You can go on the Mayflower Plymouth Plantation site. And I was supposed to be in Plymouth, Massachusetts on September 17th. because they were having the 400th anniversary, COVID-19 canceled it all. There were supposed to be 4,000 people from around the world there. And September 17th was my 75th birthday, and I thought, oh good, I'm spending my birthday with my ancient ancestors. Well, I spent it with 3 of my Waterloo friends. But anyway, so, thank you very, very much for paying attention and allowing me to talk. Do you have any questions? I think some people have asked some questions. I'll be available if you want to kind of ask some questions. But if we'll ask Pastor to maybe close with a blessing, please. By the way, my sister and her husband visited Plymouth in the middle of July when it was 95, and all the reenactors were dressed in all this garb. And I can't imagine being, no.
Actually, probably the body sweat probably kept you cool.
Yes, and kept other people away from you. No.
Well, that too. That's,
If everybody smelled like you did, it was no big deal.
yeah.
Okay, Pastor?
Okay. Heavenly Father, we thank you for Barb's presentation. We thank you for this piece of history from our nation's heritage. And we thank you for the freedoms that we do enjoy here in this country. Freedoms that are fairly unique in not only throughout the world today, but throughout world history. We pray that you would grant us an appreciation for these freedoms and for the rights that you have bestowed upon us of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In your Son's name we pray.